Hello and welcome back to Team Liquid's Strategy Guide series for Vault of the Incarnates. I am Telegon and with me today is Naguura.
Hello everyone!
In this video we are going to be breaking down the mechanics and strategy for normal and heroic Kurog Grimtotem, who you will fight as the 6th boss in the instance.
Kurog is a 3-phase encounter with 2 intermissions during which he goes immune and summons 2 adds. The first 2 phases are functionally similar, while the last phase is unique. There are 4 elemental quadrants of the arena, and his mechanics change based on which quadrant you maneuver him to.
Kurog begins in the middle of a room in a circle not affiliated with any of the 4 elements. Moving him into an elemental altar's area causes Kurog to cast Primal Shift and Primal Break on heroic. These prevent you from rapidly changing altars by doing raid-wide damage when you enter an altar and applying a 20-second debuff that amplifies this damage by 300%.
If the boss is pulled into the circle in the middle of the room, he will spam cast Elemental Surge, zapping the raid with stacking damage. This damage becomes lethal very quickly, and you should not move him into the center of the room unless absolutely necessary. This ability does not trigger when he goes to the middle to channel his intermission phases.
While Kurog is tethered to an elemental altar, he gains stacks of the appropriate elemental dominance. This functions as a buff on the boss that increases the damage from that elemental dominance. This buff stacks and triggers raid-wide damage every 4 seconds while attuned to an elemental altar. Any stacks of this buff gained persist for the duration of the encounter, so returning to altars with high stacks of that elemental dominance is very dangerous and should be avoided.
Kurog has a singular tank mechanic that he casts periodically while active, called Sundering Strike. This ability is also a frontal, and as a tank you need to be cognizant of where you are facing the boss when this ability is coming out. And as a raid you need to avoid being hit by this, as you will most likely die.
Tanks, you are probably going to want to swap on 1 stack of Sundering Strike. Now, let's talk through all the mechanics associated with each of the altars in the room. As we have said, there are 4 altars: a Flame Altar, Frost Altar, Earth Altar, and Storm Altar. Let's begin with the Flame Altar. While Kurog is tethered to this altar, he will cast his fire abilities, with one of them being an ultimate. He casts Magma Burst relatively frequently. You'll want to have your raid stack, as this ability spawns magma pools under the targeted players, and it will make it easier to deal with Searing Carnage during this phase.
Molten Rupture is the heroic ability for this altar and manifests as loose lines of swirlies that propagate out from the boss. Simply avoid these as they happen. Searing Carnage is the ultimate ability for this altar.
While Searing Carnage prefers ranged players, it can go on melee. Simply maintain the stack that you already have for Magma Burst, and move together as you drop ground effects.
This ability is extremely similar to Dark Recital from the Council of Blood in Castle Nathria.
If this type of coordination is too challenging for your raid, you can also YOLO this mechanic fairly effectively. Moving on to the Frost Altar, Kurog periodically casts Biting Chill, which is simple rot damage. His heroic mechanic is called Frigid Torrent, which is a cast he channels. For the duration of this channel, Frost Orbs shoot out from his model. They float by his model before propagating outwards, so you should have ample time to find a safe spot and not get hit if you are paying attention.
His ultimate ability while tethered to the Frost Altar is called Absolute Zero. It targets 2 players with a soak mechanic. On heroic, these soaks apply a debuff called Frostbite, which at 2 stacks causes you to be frozen solid in an ice block. This means that on normal you can likely stack these soaks and take them as a raid to simplify the mechanic, while on higher difficulties you will want to separate them and perhaps assign soakers by raid group. We recommend using a left-right convention relative to the boss.
The Earth Altar is probably the easiest along with Frost, and it has a very fun mechanic called Erupting Bedrock, where 4 concentric rings of earth centered on the boss erupt in succession. These rings always propagate away from Kurog. Enveloping Earth is the heroic mechanic of this altar, and it targets 3 players with a healing absorb. Healers will need to prioritize players with these debuffs for single target healing, if there is damage about to go out, and especially at higher stacks of Earth and Dominance. As a player with this debuff, you should consider using a defensive or calling for an external if you still have a large absorb and you are about to take significant damage.
Seismic Rupture, the ultimate ability of this altar, causes a pattern of brown swirlies to litter the play space, which summon adds upon resolution. These swirlies are larger than they appear, and you should take special care to avoid them, as being hit will likely cause you to die. Once these adds spawn, have any player with an aggro redirect use it on your tank to help them pick them up and cleave them down on the boss.
The Storm Altar is definitely one of the more dangerous. Shocking Burst is a debuff that goes on 2 players. These players will explode after 5 seconds, doing damage in a 12-yard AoE. Simply move away from other players if you receive this mechanic, and avoid players who have the circle indicator around their character. The heroic mechanic Lightning Crash applies auras to 3 players who upon expiration zap the closest player to them for damage every 1 second for 8 seconds, and themselves take 30% increased nature damage. For this mechanic, you want to ensure that your Lightning Crash is soaked by a player without Lightning Crash.
Thundering Strike is the ultimate ability of this phase. You should see indicators on the ground. Simply walk into these and wait for the mechanic to resolve. If you miss a soak, your raid will take a large amount of damage and likely cause players to die. These soaks spawn throughout the play space of the altar, so what you can do is assign players to loose areas where they should look to soak. Something like front left, front right, and so on.
Now, let's talk about Kurog's intermission phases. At 100 energy, Kurog jumps to the middle of the arena and gains Primal Barrier, a 99% damage taken reduction, and summons 2 elemental adds. The elementals in the first intermission spawn in accordance to which altars you have played during phase 1, then the 2 adds you haven't played yet will spawn later in intermission 2. Ergo, if you have played Earth and Storm for phase 1, in the first intermission, Earth and Storm adds will appear.
Let's break down the different adds that can spawn in the intermission and their mechanics. The fire add is called Blazing Fiend. As it is damaged, it spawns magma pools randomly around it. When these magma pools resolve on heroic, they also spawn an add called Smoldering Helion. These adds are tiny casters, so kick or grip them in and just cleave them down.
The frost add is called Frozen Destroyer. It has an ability called Frost Binds, which needs to be interrupted. This add also casts Frozen Tempest. This mechanic does damage based on how far away you are from the frost add itself. Make sure you are within 10 yards of the Frozen Destroyer to take minimal damage.
The earth add is called Tectonic Crusher. It casts Ground Shatter, which targets 3 players with a 5 seconds debuff, and upon resolution, those players explode for damage in a 10 yards radius. Simply spread out away from the raid for this mechanic. This add also casts Violent Upheaval, which should show several brown swirly pre-indicators near him, which upon resolution cause rocks to erupt from those locations. If you are hit by this resolution, you will likely die, so be careful and avoid them. Finally, this add has a simple tank mechanic in that the longer if it hits the same target, the more damage it does. Swapping its aggro target resets this buff, should it be necessary.
The Storm add is called Thundering Ravager. This add's only mechanics are to teleport behind a random healer and begin to channel into them with Lethal Current. This channel pulses damage around the targeted player, as the targeted player simply move away from the group for the duration of the channel. All of these adds have an additional mechanic that adds rot damage pressure to the intermission. It causes the adds to pulse, stacking damage while alive.
Once both the adds are killed in the second intermission phase, Kurog's final phase begins. It is somewhat unclear how exactly this third phase is supposed to function. In the relevant testing, Kurog had a shorter normal 100 energy phase similar to the previous phases, where he cast abilities according to the altars he was tethered to. Upon reaching 100 energy, he then gained Primal Attunement and stepped us to death while casting abilities from every altar. So it's possible that the phase 3 in the journal is intended to be an enrage. However, the way the phase reads in the journal, in our opinion, implies that this post-intermission 2 phase should function as an actual burn phase, where you have to deal with him gaining access to all of his abilities while healing through ramping raid damage.
There's a lot going on in this fight, so it is difficult to summarize by role. Instead, we'll do a summary from the perspective of the raid. You will want to plan when you are going to be in which altars and for how long. We recommend you spend most of your time in phase 1 and 2 tethered to an easier altar like Earth or Frost. It may even be possible to stay near those altars until he hits 100 energy and phases into the intermission. If not, simply spend most of your time tethered to an easy altar and spend the rest of your time until intermission tethered to a more difficult altar like Storm or Fire. According to how you're going to play the altars, you will want to assign healing cooldowns for altars where you will be gaining high stacks of elemental dominance.
Creating assignments and reminders for the soak mechanic is also something we recommend. Make sure that everyone is on the same page for Magma Burst and Searing Carnage in the fire phase. And if you're raid leading, try to be as active as possible with calls in the final phase according to the mechanics that occur. This is a fight that will have several extremely useful weak auras. We urge you to browse through the Kurog Grimtotem section of WAGO and implement them as necessary.
And with that, we very much hope you found this guide useful. If you did, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Feel free to leave feedback or commentary in the comment section, and make sure to keep your eye on this channel as more guides will be coming out soon. Thank you very much for tuning in, and we will catch you in the next one.